Hey guys, welcome back to the Help I'm a Camera Nerd podcast. I'm here again, myself, Help I'm a Nerd, and I'm here with my friend Anderson, Films by AW. And today we're going to be talking about film, shooting on film, what it's like to shoot on film, our experiences of shooting on film. And to get us started, Anderson's going to give you a brief intro to film, when it started. Take it away, Anderson.
So film itself. So film, as I'm sure many people know, was invented back in the late 1800s, and it was the standard in visual media until the 1990s when digital cinematography and photography started to take over. I forgot to put in my notes who it was invented by, but it's been used. First, it was used in more mainly photography, and in the early 20th century is when it started to be using in motion film. And with film, because it's a chemical process, and what we mean by a chemical process, the light hits the film and then creates the image, but it's the light coming through the lens that creates the image that goes on the film. So it would then need to be developed in a dark room, processed, and then put up and then projected. Back in the day, they used to edit the film by literally cutting the film, putting the film ends onto each other, and that's how they would do their edits. And then that same reel will be taken to a projector and then shot out. You know, in film, they even have like the little knobs on the film where, like, you have like the picture, and then you'll see the little like strip on the top. Well, that was on the top and the bottom, or the sides, I should say. That was to record the audio. So it was very much an analog process, much like a record player was. And yeah, it's been the standard of visual media for a very long time, nearly 100 years. And in cinema, really up until the early 2010s is when film stopped being the main visual capture. The main way people captured or shot their films was on film stock. Hence why we call a film, you know. It's like the film reel, and all they all came from the terminology of shooting on film. But yeah, I guess, we both have a bit of a history shooting on film. It's a interesting process. And, Mark, tell me a little bit about when you shot in film and, how do you felt about it?
Well, I was always nervous when I started, but when I went to film school and you learn, it always blew me away how a film camera works, because it doesn't matter what film camera it is, it basically works in the same way. And it amazed me. It was like, it's shocking that in the 1800s we could develop tech that essentially pulls the film stock through a camera at such a fast pace, but it also stops each frame for like a very small amount of, you get 24 frames in a second. So It pulls 24 frames through the camera in a second and stops each one of those frames to expose it to light for 1/24 of a second, and then goes through to the next one. And that always blew me away. That in tech, just, I don't know, something about it was just like, I can't believe that we invented something that was so precise that it could do this. And it doesn't matter what film camera you use, that's basically how they all use. They're basically mechanical devices that pull frame through the camera, expose it for a brief moment in time, and then on to the next frame. And yeah, it's kind of just, it was just so impressive. And I got to see a bunch of film cameras, but I only used one, and it was called the Arton, and it's a French film camera, and it was 16mm. And I've DP'd on film twice, but I've shot on film maybe like 7 or 8 times, in various other roles as well. So my first experience was shooting on black and white film stock on 16mm, and that was on the Arton. And it was a real nerve-wracking process, because there's no way to see what you've recorded. You can look down the eyepiece, but you're essentially just seeing a reflection of the frame. You're not seeing how it looks. So there's no way, or at least there was no way with the Arton, to see how that was going to look. So you're using a light meter to expose, and it's just a real nerve-wracking like experience. You worry if you've loaded the film camera correctly, because obviously you have to load mags up with the film. and you get a certain amount of feet of footage, which equated to, yeah, I can't remember the exact, it was maybe about 4 minutes of footage on each reel. So you would obviously practice with dud film, lacing up the mag and putting it into a camera, making sure it works and stuff. But when you get the actual film, you know, you can't expose it to light, so you're always dealing with it in a dark environment. So that would be essentially a black bag with hand holes in. You put your hands in and you do it all without looking.
Gosh.
It's not super difficult, but it is nerve-wracking, because even when you've laced it up, you just have to hope that you've done it correctly. And that it goes, and when you roll that first take, you know, you roll a bit to get it in, and you just hope that it sounds right. And obviously it makes a noise film. It's like you can hear it going through the camera, so it's not quiet. And then even then, when you're filming and you're using your light meter and you're exposing, that first time you're just filled with nerves, because you don't know if you've set your light meter up correctly. I mean, you check it and you think you have, but you just never know until you get the film stock back. You really don't know how it looks. And it's both nerve-wracking but also kind of fun and kind of exciting, because you're not going to see it. You don't see it until I think it was maybe a week, maybe just under a week, about 5 days it took. We would send it off, the film would go off for processing in Germany, and it would come back to us in a digital file. So physically sent to Germany, then they would send us one .mov just back, and you know, they would essentially do a basic grade on it, according to like your middle grey card, I guess it would be, which is what you would shoot first. That's the very first thing you shoot, and that's like, you shoot a card, expose it correctly, and it's 18% grey, I believe, and that is your exposure. Then that's how they know how to expose the film. But it's fun. It's a fun experience, you know. I highly recommend, if you ever get the chance to do it, obviously I would say do it. But it's a different experience to shooting like I'd learned to shoot before. So yeah, it's exciting but also terrifying at the same time.
You talked a lot about a light meter there. For people who don't know what that is, can you talk to me about what a light meter is and why you have to use it? Yeah.
So a light meter is built into most stills cameras. It's that thing that basically, it's that like register. So you have spot meters in most cameras, and it will basically automatically expose your camera according to what the light it's getting. So a light meter works. There's the light meters I used, there were 3 different readings. There was a general reading, and on a light meter you'll see DPs, they'll hold it up in front of people and there's a little dome on it, and that dome is a general reading. That's going to take the light coming in from multiple angles, hitting that dome, and it's going to give you a general reading of what your f-stop, t-stop should be, like according to what ISO of film you're shooting on, and your shutter angle is usually kept the same. So that will give you a general light reading. So it'll be like, 5.6, or it will tell you what you would need to expose in order to see with that general light. Then there was another reading, what's called a reflective reading, and that was basically you would spin the dome around, and the reflective reading you would hold up, and that was light bouncing inside, I believe. So that was, obviously you needed a bit more light to expose that. But the thing I would use mainly was a spot meter, basically, and you would essentially turn the dome to the side, and there was a little eyepiece you looked through, and if whatever you aimed at and clicked for the reading, it would give you what exposure you needing, what f-stop, t-stop you needed in order to expose that thing that you were pointing at. So that's how you would get, like, contrast ratio. So what I mean when I say contrast ratio is, let's say you're doing 3-point lighting on a person. It's the difference in exposure between one side of the face to the other. So a lot of the times you're trying to get some form of contrast ratio on a face. So if I point it at like the side that's shaded a little bit, it would give me a T-stop for that, and the other side it would give me a T-stop for that. And then I could pick between those two exposures where I would want to set my T-stop. You know, a lot
Yeah.
of people like to expose skin tones maybe one stop under.
Yeah.
You know, some people like to do it spot on. So that's a light meter. A light meter is a tool for measuring light, basically, that you need with film, because there's no other way for you to measure the light coming into the camera. You have no picture to see what it looks like. So you absolutely need a light meter in order to measure light. And yeah, that's what a light meter is.
It takes me back. It's been so long since I used a light meter, spot meter, anything like that. I gotta say, it's taken me back. Must be about 10 years. But I think the interesting thing, and the point you make a great point about your film stock. So obviously in digital, we're used to being able to change our sensitivity. But with film stock, for you to change the sensitivity in your film stock, you have to use different film stock, which is why you have when it's rated, when your film stock is rated at a ASA of 400 or 200 and 800. There was no 640. I can't remember. Right? It was like it was a Kodak. I think it was a 300T, 300D. I might be actually getting the names wrong. It's so long. But you basically, that film stock, that 300 was your ASA, or your ISO.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. So whereas obviously with one of our cameras, we would just click the ISO button and change the sensitivity digitally. You can't do that on film because that film stock it is what it is, and that's what it was manufactured and created to have, that light sensitivity. So the light and basically the lower your ASA, the finer your film would be if you've exposed it correctly. Because the thing about film grain that everyone kind of forgets, it's the reason you see more film grain is because that's what has happened when they've either had to recover something that's been overexposed or underexposed, or they've had to use a film stock that's higher because they didn't have much lights. So for instance, you would use a film stock of 800 and you would have to make sure you get you say you're shooting in a dark room and it's still too dark for them to bring it up. They would need to then in post in that initial grade process or processing process. That's when they would bring the exposure to the optimum exposure. And obviously if it's underexposed, the film grain, you're going to see more of it. I think it also at 800, the film grain was bigger anyway, because I don't necessarily how the science works. But it's like basically I think the film crystals are larger, thereby you're able to absorb more light. Forgive me if I butchered that, film experts, but it is an interesting process, man. I think it's definitely, it's more of a process, and like, I guess talk about that a little bit, because, I have my thoughts. Obviously, I've shot in film too, and we'll talk about that shortly, but there's a certain process and, dare I say, magic of shooting on film that's like nothing else, man. I'm sure you've had that. You feel that same way as well, right? You've had that.
Yeah,
you feel that same way as well, right?
like you were saying. So I think we shot on 400 was the stock, and I don't think there was any 640. I think basically it doubles. So it starts. I think you can get 100, then the double of that is 200. That lets in twice the amount of light. 400. Double the amount of light of 200, and then 800 is double the amount of light of 400. And so we had 400 stock, so that's not letting in a lot of light. And the first film that I shot on film, we had to light naturally. We weren't allowed to use lights. So shooting indoor with 400 stock film is obviously quite difficult, and it's also quite difficult to try and get contrast in your shot when you don't have light. So, but basically the point of that was to, build on the skills. So the skill was, the first thing we were learning was, well, see how you do just shooting on film. So there is a process, and that process is a lot more planned for each shot, because we would only get a certain amount of feet of footage, and you would have your storyboard. You would know the shots you need to get. You wouldn't get any shots outside of that storyboard pretty much, because you would make sure before you came to shoot you had what you needed, because the reality is you don't have feet to waste. It's like you've got to make sure that you get everything. So that the process then became a lot of the time timing the take, because if your take takes longer, or the actor for some reason decides they're going to take a bit longer on this take, and you burn through too much film, then you're not going to have enough footage left to finish the film. So the process is different to digital because it requires planning before you press record, because you need to know that when you press record and when you roll that film, you're getting exactly what you need, because you don't have film to spare. Now, obviously, on feature films, they do have footage to spare, but it was still the same. Like, it would cost a lot more to process film. So it was, it wouldn't be a good look if a director was going through too much film, because it was costing the production studio a lot more to get that film processed. So the process is different. It just requires more planning. You can't really rock up and just shoot. It requires you to have enough time to go through that take multiple times before you even roll. And then you really have to question, like, a phrase I hear a lot on set, and I'm guilty of this, everyone I know is guilty of this, is that take was great, let's do another. Let's just get another for safety. And I'm not knocking that. Another for safety. Let's say you get the take first time. Why not go for another take? It's not costing you anything extra. The only thing it's costing you is time. But if you've got enough time, then try something different. That's not the same with film. You're using that take that you might have recorded. Sometimes people record the rehearsal because sometimes you get magic on the rehearsal, right? You do it perfect first time. With film, you're never really giving it that option first time. The first time is a rehearsal, and you are going to time it. Someone's going to time it, and you're going to make sure that you've got enough footage to film the entire thing. So yeah, it's just more regimented, and everyone is, everyone knows that. But there is that kind of magical element that when you roll and you hear that film going through the camera, there's this kind of like, it's a little bit like shock. I think everyone feels it, even the actors feel it, because that you're not wasting footage, but using footage, and that footage is valuable. And that's why, on film sets, a lot of the time, like roll camera was the last thing you would roll. You would roll sound first, because sound it doesn't cost you anything to roll on sound. So always the order is, roll sound, rolled camera. But now I'm on a lot of sets, and they might even roll camera first, and it doesn't really matter, because you're not having to worry too much about data. I mean, obviously, when you're shooting high, like massive resolutions, it's almost brought that kind of worry about too much data back in because of file sizes. But it's not the same, is it? It's not the same as, you're not going to run out of footage when you're shooting digital, but you will run out of footage on film. And there's something quite exciting about that does feel a little bit magical, and also makes everyone aware, because everyone can hear it, and we all know that we've got to get it in a certain amount of time. So yeah, I mean, what about you? What's you shot a couple of times in various roles on film, right? So tell me about your experience. What did you find?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I've DP'd on a film we shot in Super 16, and then I first AD'd on one. And I was right after university. The production company I work for, McLagan, man, and John Rosie was a big, a wonderful filmmaker. I learned so much from him. But he was big on the film process, the filmmaking process, and he wanted us to have that experience of shooting on film, because we just finished university. Obviously, we shot on all these digital cameras, obviously the digital SLRs, like the 5D. And it was like, okay, let's learn the process of what it's actually like to go on film. So in the summers, we would, whilst I worked for him, the summers we would shoot a film on film. And so I shot a short film with a Super 16. It was an Arri Flex SR 416. Have I butchered that name? Yeah, the 416. So it was a Super 16, like their lightweight camera. And yeah, I mean, it was a great experience. I mean, the reality is, with shooting on film, the camera doesn't really matter as long as it puts film through the gate. Obviously, there's little things that that we found. Like we had a workaround for a video assist, where to get playback, we would record a DV camcorder from the feed that the camera was sending us, and then we would, we'd roll on that. So be like, okay, so playback would roll before we did a take as well. But all they're looking at is the footage. All they're looking at is the view I see in the eyepiece, not the exposure, not any kind of indication, because there's nothing technical. There's no computer in there. It's just a mechanical device that the film is going through the mag and then through the gate. And I think, there's one or two times where the like if it's not been loaded properly, then it would just kind of spool up, and then you're like, oh no, and you've wasted some film, some bits there. But you definitely feel that you feel the stress, but the excitement. You feel like that must have been like what Spielberg felt like when he was shooting Jaws, or Lucas was shooting Star Wars. And I know we weren't shooting a sci-fi, but it's more of that element of this is movie making. But you made a great point there about the preparation, because I think there's a preconception or a misconception about what it means to get a cinematic look. So we see the films that we grew up loving. One of my favorite films is Forrest Gump, or The Dark Knight, or, Sandlot, Indiana Jones, whatever. And we know those films are shot on film and they look great, and there's great movement to each scene and great motivation. But the reason for that isn't the camera. It's the preparation that goes into it. The thing about shooting on film, and you alluded to it there, is that when everyone prepared before you pressed record, there was rehearsals, there was making sure the props are in the right place, there was making sure their scene was blocked correctly, like your actor's going to walk over this side, then this side. So when they're pressing record, you're not pressing record to have a practice. You're pressing record to actually get it right. First time, if hopefully, right? Sometimes your budget didn't allow you to have a second or third time. You're like, well, we only got one go at this. But there was a preparedness and a little bit of a good anxiety we had on set, because we were preparing it. And thereby the image you were capturing, because everyone was in this heightened sense of, this has got to be all right. This has got to be right. We've got to make sure this is prepared. Even down to the movie you're making. You weren't, because film cost a lot, and, funding wasn't, back in the day wasn't as accessible as it is now. I know that's a crazy thing to say, but it really wasn't, because it was so much more expensive. The scripts that were being made were very good. There were great films. So I always used to think when we watched films in our film theory class, we'd see the short films that were being made, and they're always shot on film, and they all look great, and they're BFI funding. Like, man, maybe it's because they shot on film. It's like, no, it's because it was a ruddy good film. Ruddy. It was a bloody good film that was then funded. And then the process was the script was right, and then they storyboarded correctly, and they find the right locations. They didn't just rush and shoot something there after a week of prep and planning. It was months of meticulous planning that went into making these movies. Yeah. And then they got there with the camera and filmed it, right? And obviously your DP is using as you saying, you're exposing for, a certain way, and then you're lighting it a certain way, and you're making sure exposures. Again, everything was, it was like I don't want to disrespect actors from the military, but there was a certain military precision because of the preparedness you had to have before you pressed record. And this is going back to when you're writing your idea. And I think that's what made those films good. That's what made films, quote unquote, cinematic, not depth of field and film grain. So there's a little bit element of that being lost because of the misconception that if I just have depth of field and add a bit of film grain and have some moody images, then that makes my film cinematic. And cinematic is nothing to do with that. Cinematic is a preparedness and your story being actually good, your script actually being compelling, not, I've got this new flashy light. So, but yeah, I mean, it was really interesting shooting on the film, and it was a good process. The film we made, it was a bit of an interesting story written by my friend Lee DeVille, and I really love the process. But it also, I felt learning something about learning on film just felt more of an appropriate way to learn because of those processes and those regiments and those processes. Sorry for saying process twice, that you had to go through before you shot. And I think there's a little bit of that being lost. As cool, in a future episode we'll talk about digital versus film, but I think that little bit of that discipline process has been lost, sadly, and it affects movies, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that, even down to in between shots, obviously something you used to have to do on film was check the gate. That was something, call out in between the shots, check the gate. And checking the gate is basically, you would lose one frame of film because you would expose the gate, and that's where basically the little hatch where the film is being exposed. And you check the gate to make sure that it's clean. There's no hairs stuck in it, there's no dirt stuck in it, because if you get a hair, and you'll see when you watch films back sometimes, you'll get a little wispy thing that gets pulled into the shot and then disappears. So the idea of checking the gate in between every shot is to make sure the film is clean, because you obviously want to make sure that the shots you're getting look nice. But there's also a kind of element of, I guess, nostalgia that comes with that as well, with dirt and like grime getting stuck in there. And but it is this kind of care that is taken. And obviously, I think that, you still had bad films shot on film, right? I'm not saying that.
Yeah, of course you did.
But it's like that element of planning had to be there, because you couldn't really just, see what looked nice on the day, or like, you didn't have two cameras a lot of the time, because like obviously the big budget stuff could, but a lot of the time you wouldn't have multiple cameras, because that's costing you a lot more. It's double the amount of film to get processed. So it was only really on big stunts and stuff like that you would have multiple cameras to shoot. So I think,
or Peter Jackson films.
Yeah. So there is an element of, that planning that goes in before you shoot. And that's something, we did at film school. With the next film I shot, I think was again 400 stock, but color this time. The first film was a silent film. The second film, we were allowed to record sound, although it wasn't supposed to be sync sound. However, I cheated and recorded sync sound and the reason they don't want you to record sync sound is because the camera makes a noise, but you would record sync sound because it would help you then go and record ADR, because if you had the sound that you recorded, it was just easier for people to sync up and do that. So I cheated and recorded sync sound. But there was a certain, I feel like, I still storyboard my films, I still think about all of these films, these things that go into it, the production design, that type of stuff. And I feel like I get my best results when I put that planning in, and
100%.
There are times that you can't put that planning in necessarily, where you haven't seen the location maybe, and you wouldn't have that so much with film, because you would make sure that you could do those things, because you couldn't risk rocking up to a location. And I know now when I turn up with a camera, that camera sees enough light that you can almost film in any location really, but obviously lower stock. I mean, the base ISO of most cameras is 800, which is like that was a stock that let in a lot of light. So now our base level of what we get is almost the best you could get on film. So camera and technology has changed so that you can shoot in much lower light now, and you can be way more precise. And I think, we get incredible looking films now because you can light according to what you see on a digital screen, and that the accuracy is there.
100, yes. Yes.
So you get beautiful films now, but you got beautiful films back then. It was just, there was a bigger learning curve, because it wasn't as easy to practice. It wasn't as affordable to practice, but you could still get beautiful results. And, my second term film, when we shot on color, I used techniques that I'd learned from digital to get better results on film. So that was, I essentially built a mini set. It was a film set in a coffin about this teacher that gets buried by his student who wants to hide his bad grades. So he buries his teacher underground. So I built this coffin. Well, my dad built this coffin. I built it with him. And we made it with removable sides, and I knew that I could shine enough light in there to get an exposure, and then I would fill the coffin with with haze, smoke to get those beams of light in there. And that's techniques that I'd learned from shooting on digital that I could then apply to film. So it's kind of backwards in a way. But yeah, it's a process that I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't always choose to shoot on film. We had the option. I shot my film, my 5th term film, A Bite to Eat, and we picked digital. We picked the Alexa, and I picked Alexa over Super 35 film. And the reason that I did that is because I'd seen a lot of the films that had been shot. Actually, no, I tell a lie. It was our 4th term film, which was a black and white film in a studio, and we picked Alexa to shoot over 35mm film. And the reason that I picked digital over film was because I was seeing a lot of films that had been shot on the Super 35mm camera. In my opinion, you had a lot of soft focus in certain shots. I figure there must have been it was either people not hitting their focus marks, because obviously it's much harder to get a sharp focus on film. You don't have any monitor to look at, so you're basically taking measurements. So if for any reason your lens maybe is old and something's gone wrong with the focus, then you're gonna be getting out of focus and you won't necessarily know. So the process for pulling focus on film for us was a lot different than it was for shooting on digital, because obviously you can't see if it's in focus. And I didn't want to take that risk, and the director didn't want to take that risk, and we knew that we were going to be able to see what we were getting or closer to it on the Alexa. So yeah, it was a way more risky process, and part of me wishes that we'd taken that risk, because you don't often get chances to learn, and there is a certain element of me that wishes that we'd just taken that chance and used it when we could. And I think that's something I would recommend, if you're ever in the position to take that chance, then take it, because it doesn't crop up often, and you're not going to be given the opportunity to shoot film out there in the industry a lot, because it just costs too much and it's too big a risk for a lot of people, for especially producers. They're not it's hard to get film processed, and big films, you would have dailies where it would be processed and returned, and they would sit down at the end of the day and watch the dailies. For us, we couldn't do that. It would just go off, and you would hope that when it came back and you'd finished filming, that you would have done everything right. So yeah, I would say, my recommendation is, if you have the option, shoot on film. Take it when you get it.
I think again, it's a wonderful place to learn, and I think there's a certain magic to it. And from a DP's perspective, everyone trusted you. They trusted that you knew what you were doing. There was no one over your shoulder to say, "Oh, it's a bit dark in the monitor. Can you?" Everyone trusted that director of photography knew exactly what he was doing. He got the image you wanted to get, and it was going to look great, because you could see through playback and through the video assist that you saw the frame of what he was getting. You saw the action, but you're not seeing the exposed film. You're not seeing what it looks like. And I always thought that was such a fascinating aspect or mentality on set, or psychology to the set, where that one person, it's all on them, really. Which is why, with a lot of older films, you see a lot of ASC, BSC people shooting it, because it was like, these were the best people. I remember even Roger Deakins saying he was even, and for people who don't know Roger Deakins, he is one of the greatest cinematographers to ever live. And he was saying, like, he would stress about getting the dailies back. And he's one of the, as I said, one of the greatest cinematographers to ever live. Mm-hmm. And even he had that stress. So you knew there was, but then that's where they got the pay the big bucks. That's where they deserved it.
Yeah.
Where I'm not saying it's like anybody could DP now, but I think there's you're able to take a lot more risks, because you can see the results, things that we take for granted now, false color, zebras, histogram, where you could see exactly how much exposure or what's clipping, or when I say clipping, what's overexposed and is unrecoverable. There's a film you couldn't. But the flip side of film is that it was quite forgiving. If you and what we mean by that is because of the way it was processed. If you were underexposed or overexposed, you could correct the levels back and still have a good image. That was something that digital cameras didn't really do very well up until really the Reds, and even the Reds didn't have as much dynamic range, or sorry, the Alexa, I should say. The Red and then the Alexa. I mean, I know the Sony F35 and the Panavision Genesis, they did it, but they didn't have loads of dynamic range. I think if you look back and you look at the dynamic range, you're like, well, I'm not using that. I'd rather use like a Pocket 6K or whatever.
Yeah.
But so that was the thing about film. It was actually quite forgiving once you did it right, or if some part of the imagery needs to be brought down. That's where the colorists could then make the tweaks they needed to make. So it's really fascinating seeing how there's elements of it that were better up until it was the optimal way to capture film up until we're only talking the last 10 years after being invented in the 1880s,
Yeah.
which is incredible.
You know what? I actually
Last point, Mark, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I have a funny story. I remember getting the footage back from the film I DP'd, the very first film on black and white film, and the director, I'm on the train going back to film school. The director calls me and he's like, "Looks terrible. It's really bad. It's flat. It just doesn't look good. It's horrible." And I was like, "Oh no, I failed." And I remember going in to watch the footage, watch it back and stuff, and it was absolutely fine. Then he just blown it completely out of proportion, and it was like, looks perfect. It looks exactly like we intended it to look. It's just black and white, and it's not super contrasty because we haven't been able to use actual light. But yeah, I remember just dreading it and going in and being like, oh, thank God, thank goodness that it looks fine and it's all good. And you do get that relief, and it's a nice feeling when you see that you've done a good job.
So guys, thanks you again for joining us. It was a really interesting episode there, and we could reminisce a little bit on film. But thanks guys. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow both of our YouTube channels. That's Help I'm a Nerd and Films by AW, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys soon. Again, we're looking at your comments. Keep liking and commenting, and we'll see you on the other side. Peace out.
Bye guys.